Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Southern Fire Exchange webinar. My name is David Godwin, and I am the director of the Southern Fire Exchange program with the University of Florida. From our Southern Fire Exchange team, I'm joined today by Elliot Nauert with NC State University. Today, we are excited to feature our presentation from Dr. Tori Donovan from the University of Florida School of Forest, Fisheries, and Geomatics Sciences. Dr. Donovan will be sharing a presentation on recent trends in satellite-detected wildfires in the eastern United States. Our presenter today is Dr. Tori Donovan. Tori is an assistant professor of forest management at the University of Florida, West Florida Research and Education Center in Milton, Florida. Dr. Donovan has a BS from Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, Canada, an MS from Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario, and a PhD from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She has a teaching and research faculty appointment with the University of Florida. Her lab uses remote sensing and field measurement to try and understand fire and landscape ecology, with a focus on understanding how disturbance processes enhance or degrade ecosystem resilience, and how this information can be further integrated into ecosystem management. So with all that, welcome, Tori. We're glad to have you with us today. Thanks for joining us, everybody, online. And just 1 second as we trade out presentations.
All right, here we go. All right, well, thank you so much for the introduction. As David said, my name is Victoria, or Tori Donovan. I'm an assistant professor out of the West Florida Research and Education Center in Milton at the University of Florida. Today, I'm going to be talking about a research paper that myself and my colleagues recently released looking at trends in large wildfire patterns in the eastern US. And I'm also going to dive into some other corresponding research that some of my graduate students actually have been working on to dive further into these patterns that we're seeing. So before I begin, I just want to acknowledge, first of all, my co-authors on the primary research I'm presenting today, who are Doctors Ray Crandall, Jennifer Phil, and Carissa Wonka, and then also my graduate students, Noah Weidig and Michaela Ivey. A lot of this research was also funded by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine Gulf Research Program, the USDA NEFA, as well as the University of Florida. So a lot of us are familiar with headlines like this one. They've been filling our news feeds for decades now. We've heard about increasing large wildfires in the western US, in places like California, and they're driving a number of human fatalities and damage to structures as well. But we don't commonly associate these types of headlines with areas outside of the western United States, where over the last century or so, wildfires really haven't been a common occurrence. But we're starting to see signals that wildfires are really not restricted. These big, large, destructive wildfires are really not restricted only to the western United States. So for instance, this is a headline from the 2016 Gothenburg fires in Tennessee that resulted in multiple human fatalities and also millions of dollars in structural damage. And I'm sure people have heard of the recent large wildfire that burned through the Texas Panhandle as well. So we're starting to recognize that large wildfires are not limited only to the West. And we can see these changes happening when we look at data across different regions. So this is from a study by Iglesias et al., 2022. And in this map here, we are looking at large wildfires plotted out as these yellow points, and the orange and red points are looking at some of the really large mega fires that burned across the US between 1984 and 1999. And so what you can see is in this map, really we see most of those large wildfires are concentrated in the western United States. But when they mapped out this same pattern from 2005 to 2018, you can see that we have a much greater concentration of large wildfires occurring in the US Great Plains, as well as in the Southeast as well. And when they looked at these trends across the different regions, in these different plots here, the blue area is looking at trends from 1984 to 1998, and the orange is looking at patterns from 2005 to 2018. And you can see, we're characterizing these large shifts in area burned, the number of fires per year, fire size in the western US, and substantial increases in the Great Plains. But we're also starting to see these early signals of change in the eastern US as well. And this is particularly concerning because the eastern US has a very high population density. And so increases in large wildfires like we're seeing out west could have substantially more detrimental impacts in the east. So today, what I want to talk about is what's going on with large wildfire in the east. And I want to break this presentation down into kind of 3 different sections. I want to start off by talking about where we've been and what our general fire history is in the eastern US as a broad region. And then I want to talk about where we are now, focus on a lot of that research that we've started conducting, looking at trends in large wildfires and regime characteristics. And then I want to talk a little bit about where we might go. What are the next steps that we could take to try to reduce some of our wildfire risk and change this trajectory? So to start off, I want to focus on this map of fire regimes that occurred prior to Euro-American settlement in the United States that was produced by Guyette et al. In 2012. So here we're looking at mean fire return interval, as I mentioned, prior to Euro-American settlement. And you can see that the southeastern US was one of the most frequently burned regions in the United States. So this color gradient here represents our fire return interval, where a more orange color is showing a very frequent fire return interval, and those cooler colors, the blues and purples, are showing a more of an infrequent fire return interval. And so you can see a large portion of Texas and a large portion of Florida, for instance, had mean fire return intervals of less than 2 years prior to Euro-American settlement. These fires would have been started by lightning ignitions, as well as fires stewarded by Native Americans that burned across much of this area. And so the ecological communities that we live in today were formed and are fundamentally shaped by these frequent fire regimes. For instance, I'm sure many of us are familiar with longleaf pine savanna, which is a well-known example of a frequent fire-dependent ecosystem. And it's clear, if we go even further back in the history of savanna and grassland ecosystems overall, that fire plays a fundamental role in their evolution and their existence. So in this plot here, what we're looking at is relative charcoal flux in ocean sediment, which translates just to fire occurrence from a really long time ago. And so we've got this indicator of fire occurrence on our y-axis, and on our x-axis, we're looking at the number of millions of years ago. And so you can see that we have this big spike in fire occurrence about 10 million years ago. And we see that this coincides with a major spread of grassland and savanna ecosystems across the globe. And it's now well established within the scientific literature that these types of open ecosystems are highly dependent on fire. We generally talk about this in relation to a grass fire cycle. So fire in an area prevents most trees and shrubs from establishing, and this allows us to have a high dominance of herbaceous vegetation. These grasses and other herbaceous vegetation in the understory, for instance, in a savanna, burn very easily. They're very pyrogenic, so they promote more frequent fires. And these frequent fires then continue to prevent tree and shrub establishment, which would shade out the grasses, and they continue to allow those grasses to persist. So we have this grass fire cycle that's evolved to promote these ecosystems across much of their current distribution. So when we think about that, it really makes sense that the Southeast in particular was one of these most frequently burned places in the country prior to Euro-American settlement, because we have many of these open savanna systems with dominated by these grassy understories. Now, when Europeans settled in the United States, what happened was they displaced Native Americans from their lands. This meant that Native American fire stewardship that had helped to promote frequent fire in these open ecosystems was lost. And we also saw a shift in how lands were managed in terms of fire suppression. So when fires did occur, either accidentally or through a lightning ignition, we saw a movement towards suppressing most of these fires. And so we had this rapid shift in fire culture where we saw the almost complete eradication of fire from many of our US ecosystems. And so this led to regions, or this has led to regions like the Great Plains and the southeastern US to be considered low risk for fire. A lot of people that I've talked to in these regions who aren't familiar with fire and fire management, not as much in Florida, but they aren't aware that fire is an important part of these ecosystems. So a lot of that knowledge has been lost. So where have we been? Just to sum up, fire and open ecosystems are highly intertwined, and we generally associate this with a grass fire cycle, where fires help to promote grasses, and they in turn help to promote more frequent fires. And the Southeast is one of the most frequent, or was historically one of the most frequently burned regions in the entire United States. However, following Euro-American settlement, we had suppression of fire that tried to eradicate fire from most of the eastern United States relatively effectively. Smokey the Bear was quite an effective campaign. So I want to shift over to where are we now? As I mentioned, we're starting to see these early signals of change in large wildfire occurring in the eastern US. And so when I moved down to Florida at the end of 2022, one of the first things I wanted to do was understand what was going on with large wildfire in this region. So I wanted to identify just large wildfire regime characteristics across the eastern US, and then track changes in trends to see if we were actually seeing these increasing trends that we're seeing signals of, and where those trends were happening. So I collected data, myself and my colleagues collected data from MTBS, the Monitoring Trends and Burn Severity Database, from 1984 to 2020. So we looked at large fire perimeters. Those are perimeters for fires that were greater than 200 hectares in size. So this gave us 2,433 large wildfires to analyze. And we broke the eastern US up into 35 different ecoregions. So we designated the entire eastern US using level 1 EPA ecoregions for the eastern temperate forests. And then we used 35 level 3 EPA ecoregions to distinguish different regions based on their similarities in biophysical characteristics. So where we would expect to see higher concentrations of fire based on the ecology of those systems. It's important to note that social dynamics are not included within these boundaries. So I want to start off by just talking about what our current large wildfire regime is. So this is just a summary of all of the large wildfire data across our different ecoregions. So everything that we had between 1984 and 2020. In this map here, we're looking at wildfire number, where the darker the orange color, the more large wildfires we had within an ecoregion over our study period. And so you can see that the southern coastal plain, which makes up the majority of Florida, as well as it travels all along the Gulf Coast there into Louisiana. And then the Central Appalachians ecoregion, which falls kind of in the middle of the eastern US, had by far the greatest number of large wildfires relative to other ecoregions, but generally we see the most large wildfires occurring in the southeast. In this map, we're looking at wildfire size. Again, the darkening orange color signals a larger wildfire size. And you can see here again that southern coastal plain that makes up the majority of Florida had some of the largest average wildfire sizes, along with the middle Atlantic coastal plain, which runs all along that eastern coast. And we also see some very large wildfires occurring in the east central Texas plain, which is on our far western boundary, and the Arkansas Valley, which falls within the state of Arkansas. When we look at patterns for total wildfire area burned, you'll notice that this map looks almost identical to wildfire number. And so what this tells us is the number of large wildfires is having the biggest impact on how much land is being burned across the eastern US rather than wildfire size. So number is driving the trends that we're seeing in the overall area burned. Okay, and so the next thing we wanted to do was assess changes in these large wildfire regimes through time. And so what we did was we used Mann-Kendall's tau, which indicates the strength and the directionality of these trends through time. And so the darker the red color in this map, the stronger the increasing trend, in this case, large wildfire number. The darker the blue color, the stronger the decreasing trend. The gray areas represent locations where there wasn't enough data through time for us to assess temporal trends. We didn't feel confident in assessing temporal trends, and our cutoff for that was less than 10 large wildfires. And so what you can see from this map is that a lot of the Southeast is experiencing increases in wildfire number through time. We see that in Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, and then of course, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia, and Florida. So a lot of our Southeastern states have regions that are experiencing large increases in large wildfire. When we look at wildfire size, we actually see some places like the southeastern plains, which is just above the southern coastal plain there of Florida. We actually see that decreasing through time in large wildfire size slightly. So we're seeing some different patterns between number and size. But in general, most of our southeastern ecoregions were also experiencing some increases in large wildfire size, particularly again in Arkansas, as well as in the Ridge and Valley ecoregion, which kind of pops bright red here in the middle of our study area. And this runs from Alabama all the way up to Virginia, that ecoregion. And we also saw, of course, then increases in total hectares burned by large wildfires, again, occurring across most of the southeastern ecoregions. A lot of those trends, again, are mirroring patterns in wildfire number over wildfire size. We also saw shifts in large wildfire seasonality over our study period as well. So this tells us when large wildfires are actually occurring during the year. And this metric can have large implications for how we allocate suppression resources and when, both federally and within state. And it also has impacts on the ecology of systems as well, since a lot of systems have evolved under a certain seasonality of fire. Perhaps maybe they release seeds based on fire burning in spring rather than fall. And so this is another metric that we were really interested in quantifying. So in this figure, what we're looking at is a Bray-Curtis dissimilarity index for seasonality between the first decade of our assessment and the last decade of our assessment. And so the darker the red means the more dissimilarity there was between fire seasons between these two decades. You'll notice that much of our map is gray, and this is because a lot of the ecoregions just did not have large wildfires occurring in the first decade of our assessment, and so we just simply couldn't run this comparison on them. But for the ones that we could, we created these density distributions to compare the patterning in fire season between these first and last decades. So each one of these plots represents a different one of the ecoregions that are colored in this map. We've got fire density on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, we're looking at, I have month plotted out, but that's really date. So these density distributions are based on 365 days of the year and where wildfires are occurring across that decade. So the red density distribution here is representing our most recent decade from 2011 to 2020. And the gray distribution is representing our first decade of assessment, 1984 to 1993. And so if we just focus in on a couple of these, if you look at the Middle Atlantic coastal plain and the southeastern plains, you'll see that large wildfires are becoming more common in the early spring. So we're seeing the shift in that red distribution towards the left-hand side of the plot, towards that January, February, March, April kind of area. And then if you look at the southern coastal plain, you'll notice that we're seeing large wildfires are becoming more common within the late spring and early summer, and we're seeing them become less common within the fall. So with these results, one of the first things that people are interested in is how are these large wildfires impacting people? What is the risk that they're posing to people? Obviously, because we have more wildfires, there's increased risk of exposure, to people. But when we're thinking about risk, we often think about the wildland-urban interface, or the WUI. This is where wildland vegetation and urban development intermingle. And it's generally where we see the greatest amount of destruction to human settlements from large wildfires. Now, it's particularly important in the eastern US because we have such a substantial WUI that's continuing to grow through time. So in this map here, you're looking at the distribution of WUI across the US. And I want you to just pay attention to the red and the yellow. Those are the colors of the WUI. And so you can see the amount of WUI that we have in the eastern US compared to the Great Plains and the western US. So again, these large wildfires could pose a substantial threat here in the east. So this is research that my master's student, Noah Weidig, actually took on. In this first graph Noah created, we're looking at just the proportion of all of the large wildfires that burned in each ecoregion that actually occurred with the WUI. So he looked at every wildfire that intersected the wildland-urban interface and then created a proportion and plotted it out here. So just to give you an example of differences in ecoregions, recall the ecoregions that had the largest amount of large wildfires were the Central Appalachians and the Southern Coastal Plain. But when we break these patterns down and these fires down and only look at wildfires that intersect the WUI, what we can see is that the Central Appalachian wildfires have a much greater risk than the Southern Coastal Plain. Over 75% of the large wildfires occurring in the Central Appalachians are occurring within the WUI or intersecting the WUI. In contrast, in the Southern Coastal Plain, we're seeing that just over 25% of our large wildfires in this region are intersecting the WUI. It's still a large number, but there's clearly a difference in the level of potential threat to people when we consider the WUI in our assessments. So Noah created similar maps to what I did, actually mirrored maps almost of what I did, but for wildfires that are only occurring within the WUI. And what he found is that we are still seeing a lot of increasing trends through time across these ecoregions for wildfires in the WUI, but very few of these trends were statistically significant, and they were generally much weaker than what we had seen when we looked at ecoregions overall. And actually, when Noah compared WUI wildfires to non-WUI wildfires, so he just broke them into two different categories, what he found was that the patterns in increasing wildfires were much stronger outside of the WUI than they were in the WUI. And so what this suggests to us is we do have these early signals of increasing wildfire within the WUI across a lot of the eastern US, but we still have a little bit of time to get ahead of this, in that these early trends that we're seeing are generally falling outside of the WUI, or these increases are generally occurring outside of the WUI. So the next major question that I get after I present these results is why? Why is this happening? Why are we seeing an increase in large wildfires? And to talk about this, we really need to consider the three main factors that control large wildfire regimes. That's ignitions, fuels, and weather and climate conditions that are conducive to fire. So I want to take a second to walk through each one of these. I'm gonna focus on the ones where I've done more research. But let's start off by just talking about ignitions. So in the US, 88% of wildfires are started by human ignitions. This is work, statistics done by Balch et al. 2017. And so as people continue to expand into wildland areas, as we continue to see the expansion of the WUI, we also continue to add this increased potential for large wildfires started by human ignitions. You can see in this plot here, again from the Balch paper, while we're looking at the entire eastern temperate forest ecoregion and all of the ignitions for wildfires, the red bars are human-caused ignitions, the blue bars are lightning-caused ignitions. And what you can see is that we have far more human-caused ignitions throughout the entire year than we do lightning ignitions. Our lightning ignitions are generally concentrated within the summer months, and our human-caused ignitions are largely concentrated within the spring. We actually did an assessment within our geophysical research letters paper to assess the changes in the proportion of human versus lightning ignition. So we wanted to know, are we seeing as large wildfires increase, are we also seeing an increase in the number of human ignitions or the number of lightning ignitions that might say that, the actual number of ignitions might be driving some of these changes. So in this map that I'm showing here, we're looking at the log odds for the proportion of human ignitions. Basically, do we see an increase in the proportion of human ignitions across all of our different ecoregions? And again, darkening red suggests a greater positive odds. A darkening blue is a greater negative odds. And basically what we found is about 50% of ecoregions had slightly positive trends and 50% of ecoregions had slightly negative trends, and none of these were statistically significant. And so what this suggested to us is that ignitions are not really a limiting factor for large wildfires in this region. They don't appear from this analysis, at least, to be a major driver of the increases that we're seeing through time. Fuels is another really important one to talk about everywhere, but particularly in the US. Even though wildfires are increasing in the US and actually globally, the world itself is in a fire deficit, meaning that there are far fewer fires now than there were historically. And when we remove fire, we tend to see a much larger accumulation of fuels, more vegetation growing. And this can then increase our risk for large fires that are much more difficult to suppress because we have a much higher fuel load. Recall that grass fire cycle that I mentioned at the start of the talk. A lot of this increase in fuel load comes from woody encroachment, from trees and shrubs encroaching into these areas that previously were dominated by herbaceous vegetation. When we remove that frequent fire, as we've done for the last century with our fire suppression practices, we're allowing woody vegetation to move into these systems and increase the amount of above ground biomass. You can see here a comparison of two photos from the famous Stoddard plots at Tall Timbers Research Station, where we're looking on the left at a site that has been unburned for decades, compared to, on the right, a site where we've had frequent fire every 2 years for multiple decades. And so you can see the difference in fuel load between these two plots. And to give you an idea of why this change in fuel load impacts fire risk so much, I really like to use this photo. It's taken in the Great Plains, where eastern red cedar is a major issue associated with woody encroachment. And this is from a prescribed fire. It's burning, all of these fuels are burning under the exact same conditions. The only difference is the fuel. And you can see the flame lengths that we have on grasses that are burning, again, on that left-hand side of the photo, compared to the flame lengths that we see on this single torching cedar tree. And so you can imagine how much more difficult it would be for us to suppress and control fire, how much easier it is for this fire to spread over greater distances compared to fires burning in those herbaceous fuels. So my graduate student, Michaela Ivy, is investigating these relationships between woody cover and wildfire occurrence. So in these maps here, or sorry, in these figures here, we are looking at, again, our individual ecoregions within the eastern United States. And we've got fire occurrence or fire density on the y-axis. And on the x-axis, we have percent woody cover. So we have this gradient of woody cover, where the left-hand side, we have no woody cover, and the right-hand side, we have 100% woody cover. Now we have two different density distributions we're looking at here. The blue distribution is a null distribution. So this is the distribution of wildfire that we would expect on the landscape if wildfire was just distributed randomly and woody cover had absolutely no impact on wildfire occurrence. The orange distributions are showing the true distribution of wildfire relative to woody cover within each one of these ecoregions. And so what you can see is that in a lot of these ecoregions, we see that large wildfires are much more likely to occur, much more frequent in these high density woody covered areas compared to what we would expect at random. And she's actually created a map here with odds ratios. So we ran statistical tests on this to see how the odds of large wildfire changed as we increased the percentage of woody cover. And what we found is across all the ecoregions that we had enough data to assess, we had an increasing probability or an increasing odds of large wildfire as we increased the percentage of woody cover. And this is a particular problem because Michaela also has found that in every one of our eastern US ecoregions, we're seeing long-term positive increases, positive trends or increases in woody cover through time. So in these plots here, again, this is every ecoregion in the eastern US. We have percent woody cover on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, we just have year. And she's looking at the same study period as we did in our original wildfire trends study. And so you can see we have these pretty strong increases across every ecoregion. And this is even occurring in the southern coastal plains. Again, that region makes up the majority of Florida. So even though Florida has really this iconic prescribed burn culture, the patterns of how we're burning hasn't been enough to prevent woody encroachment. We see about a 5% increase across that region overall over this last 30 or 40-year period. The final thing that I want to talk about is weather and climate. We know that weather and climate have been associated with large wildfire increases out west. There's been a lot of research on this. And so we're really interested in the role that weather and climate are playing in terms of these large-scale wildfire regime patterns. Over our study period, we know that things like temperature and drought have been increasing. So this is just a map from the NOAA showing the trend in temperature through time across the study period that we used for our wildfire trends study. And you can see that we've had increases in our mean temperature through time over the same period. We haven't conducted our assessments yet to determine how this might be impacting wildfire occurrence. But stay tuned because Michaela has started to dive into this, and she is looking at the relationships between climate, woody cover, and large wildfire occurrence. And we're hoping that she'll have that research ready to show soon. So to summarize, where are we now? Wildfires are increasing across the eastern US, particularly across much of the southeastern US. And a number of these wildfires are occurring within, these large wildfires are occurring within the WUI, which poses a real threat to human life and property. At the same time, we're seeing that the strength of those increasing trends is much higher outside the WUI than inside of the WUI. And so it provides us with the opportunity to try to get ahead of some of these increases and try to maximize management to reduce potential further increases in the WUI. We know from Michaela's research that increasing fuel loads are one contributing factor to this increase in large wildfires that we're seeing. And we also think that changing climate is likely playing a significant role as well. And these factors are something that we need to continue to look into in the future. So I want to finish off by talking about where we might go with this information. It's clear that removing fire from our systems doesn't work. We've tried that over the last century. What we've seen is substantial ecological degradation of our fire-dependent systems, and we're now seeing this high level of wildfire risk increasing across the country. We also know that we're predicted to continue to see increasing temperatures and drought occurrence across much of the Southeast, which will exacerbate risk for wildfire in the future. In this map, we're just looking at, again, information from the NOAA, where we're looking at different climate scenarios for high emissions in red and lower emission scenarios in yellow. And regardless of emission scenario, we're going to see continued increases in temperature through time. We also know that unless we shift how we're managing these systems, we're going to continue to see increases in woody cover. And we also have other risks as well, like the expansion of invasive species like Kogan grass, which can increase fire intensity and make fires much more difficult to control and ecologically detrimental. And this is another area of research that we are currently investigating. So what can we do? One of the first things that I always suggest is that we can fight fire with fire by embracing prescribed fire as a tool to help sustain these fire-dependent ecosystems while at the same time decreasing our wildfire risk. We can use these prescribed fires to reintroduce this grass fire cycle into our systems while negating the risk that comes with wildfires. We put these into our systems under controlled conditions, so we can safely get fire back into the system and reduce those fuel loads. Prescribed fires are much safer than waiting for large wildfires to occur. For instance, if we talk about spot fires, which are spot fires that are started from lofted embers. They come from a fire that's already burning. Those embers are lofted up into the air and carried to a new location, and they can start a new fire, which makes suppression much more difficult. They're also the #1 cause of house destruction during wildfires because they get lofted up into vents or land on roofs and cause new ignitions on homes. And we know that woody encroachment can greatly increase spot fire risk. But what we see is when we compare distance of spot fires, so the potential distance that these embers can travel and start new fires, between prescribed fires and wildfire conditions, we see that there's much, much less risk associated with burning under prescribed fire conditions. So in this plot on the left-hand side that I have here, we're looking at maximum spot fire distance in kilometers under prescribed fire conditions and wildfire conditions relative to 3 different encroachment scenarios. So grasslands in yellow, orange, we have encroached grasslands, and then in red, we have woodlands. So fully encroached areas with high density woody cover and no herbaceous understory. And what you can, or very little herbaceous understory. And what you can see is regardless of the encroachment scenario, our prescribed fires are much safer than waiting for these large wildfires to occur. We also know that, for instance, the number of fatal injuries from using prescribed fires is far lower than for people who have to fight these large wildfires. So again, using prescribed fire to preemptively reduce fuel loads rather than waiting for these what we know now are inevitable large wildfires, it's much safer to use our prescribed fires. So in order to help promote prescribed fire, we need to continue to educate people on the value of prescribed fire across the eastern US to help support public awareness and acceptance. Social pushback against prescribed fire is a major limitation for getting prescribed fire on the ground. The other thing we need to do is provide resources to support the application of prescribed fire by agencies as well as landowners. Things like prescribed burn associations, PBAs, can really help to support getting fire on private lands and helping to promote more good fire on the landscape. But at the same time, we know that prescribed fire can't prevent all wildfires. It's not going to be able to mitigate for climate change. And we know that we have these natural ignitions and human ignitions. It's impossible for us to completely eliminate fire. Wildfire is inevitable. It's a part of our systems, and we're not going to be able to remove it. So the other thing that we need to do is we need to prepare for wildfire the same way that we prepare for any other natural disaster. People in Florida, where I am now, are very familiar with preparing for things like hurricanes, and we need to be able to do the same for wildfires. Firstly, we can create defensible space around our homes and our buildings by removing flammable vegetation that can cause our house to burn or promote lofted embers that can lead to spot fires on our buildings and structures. We can also create fire-resistant homes and buildings or retrofit our homes and buildings with these fire-resistant materials to decrease the probability that if a fire does come nearby your property, it's much less likely that it will be completely destroyed or consumed. And finally, we need to have evacuation plans in place for different wildfire scenarios that could happen, so we know what to do when a wildfire is coming towards us. Where do we go? And we're prepared to go at the same time, so we have an evacuation kit ready to leave if we need to. There are a number of resources that are, and they're continuing to grow. For instance, Firewise USA has some great resources to raise awareness on wildfire and how to prepare for it. And we need to continue to raise awareness on this and have people pay attention to the fact that wildfire is a risk, not only in the Western US, but across the country. So I just want to take a second now to just summarize everything we've talked about here. What is going on with wildfire in the Southeast? First of all, we know that frequent fire is an important part, is an important part of systems in the Eastern US and particularly our Southeastern systems. We know that this frequent fire was suppressed and removed for over the last century. And we associate this with increasing large wildfires occurring in the Eastern US, particularly in the Southeast. We think this is probably a combination of changing climate and the associated increase in fuel load from woody encroachment due to fire suppression. And we've found evidence to directly link woody encroachment to these increases in large wildfire. And so where can we go? We need to continue to promote prescribed fire within our systems, get good fire on the landscapes. And we also need to recognize that wildfire and fire in general is a part of the ecosystems that we live in. We need to learn how to coexist with fire, prepare for these wildfires to happen, and know what we're going to do when they do occur. So with that, my contact information is here. Again, I'd like to thank my different co-authors and my graduate students and the different funders we had for this research. And if I haven't talked way over my time, it doesn't look like I have, I should have time for some questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. Oh, I'm getting an echo. Stop.
Did you want me to stop sharing?
What's that? Yeah,
Did you want me to stop sharing?
I have a feeling people are going to want to see some of your slides in some of these questions. Some of the questions that came in were very, very specific. So if you want to keep your sharing going, then you can jump back to refer to some of the slides. I think it's going to be helpful. I see we have people who have put questions into the Q&A tool in Zoom. Please go ahead and do so if you have questions, or if you see questions from other folks and you'd like to give it a thumbs up, we'll try and get to it. In the time we have remaining, let's go right in. We have a question that came in early on, and this is referring specifically to the maps from Shlomia, and they ask, is the current wildfires in the current wildfire regime maps? I think at the beginning of the presentation. What does the clean white represent? The key, they point out, appears to start with light gray. And we saw that came up in a couple other comments in the chat during the presentation.
Thank you. Yeah, so these white sections, I assume you mean up in the northern portion of the Eastern US. Those are regions that fell outside of the Eastern Temperate Forest ecoregion, so they were excluded from our analysis. We needed some way to be able to create a distinction for our region, and so we excluded anything that didn't fall within that EPA categorization of the Eastern Temperate Forests. Okay,
so that explains those gaps in the map. We had quite a few people who were very concerned about that, understandably so.
I'm sorry about that. I'll be sure to explain that better next time, so thank you.
That's all right. And then we had a couple questions that came in about specific regions. Andrew was interested in regions and the trends in New England. And then also if you could comment on Andrew noted an apparent decreasing trend in Wisconsin and Minnesota on one of the maps. So do you have comments on either New England or Wisconsin, Minnesota?
Yeah, so a lot of those areas, again, in the northern portion of the eastern US. So I think, let me just, these questions are, oops, jumping. I was looking. So I think one of them was what's going on with some of these areas. We were restricted to only large wildfires in our assessment. So that was anything larger than 200 hectares. So when areas are grayed out, all that meant was that there weren't enough large wildfires for us to do a temporal assessment. If you were referring specifically to these areas, we have a few that are grayed out in our overall regime, and that's where we had zero. There were no large wildfires that were over 200 hectares in size over our study period. In these other cases where they were gray, it was simply because there were not enough large wildfires for us to do a statistical assessment on that. We didn't feel. In the region up north here, where we're seeing that pretty strong declining trend, we haven't analyzed that further. We are looking at that more with Michaela's data, with our woody cover information. But what we suggest that might be due to is mesophication, as well as increasing precipitation in those regions. So over our study period, there were some increases in precip in that area. We think that might have contributed to less fire conducive conditions. And then of course, in a lot of those forests, I'm sure people are aware we're experiencing a lot of mesophication, which can reduce the probability of fire when we maintain those moist conditions. So that's what we suspect might be going on there.
Mhm. We have a comment from Travis in the Q&A, and Travis says, as someone who is heavily involved in forestry prescribed fires, as well as hazard mitigation, the lack of financial resources for home and property owners to mitigate these fuels and become firewise as well as the lack of manpower for forestry, I'm thinking agencies, to achieve prescribed burnings throughout the year seems to be a huge factor in the devastation of these fires, says Travis. Especially in the southeastern US. So he's asking for your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I agree. I think there definitely is a lack of resources. There's a lack of social and political awareness around this issue. And I think, or I hope that with studies like this one, as we begin to characterize and make it more well known that this wildfire risk is not only out west, but it is in other regions like the Great Plains and here in the eastern US. We'll start to see more people focus on that, and hopefully we'll start to see more allocation of resources. And there's lots of people who, extension specialists and people like that who are much better at taking this information, hopefully, and presenting it to people and getting it into the right hands. So we'll see that shift.
We had a comment that came in from Brett in the chat early on, and Brett was saying it would be interesting to analyze the trends in drought and vapor pressure deficit, VPD, in addition to temperature over the same period to see if these variables can help explain increases in large wildfires with regards to climate change.
Yes, absolutely. And for this presentation, I pulled a couple basic plots. But as I mentioned, my student Michaela is working actually with a climatologist to acquire some really great data that we can look into a number of these different variables, and that's something that she's working on analyzing now. So hopefully we'll have a lot more detailed climate metrics than what I presented here that we'll analyze.
We had a question from Leah in the Q&A. And Leah says, do large-scale eastern forest fires show the same pattern as western ones? In that disturbed forests, old growth that has been harvested and replanted burns first and hotter than mature and older sections of the forest.
So that's not something that we have analyzed yet, but it would be an interesting thing to dive into. We started work on this research a year and a half ago, and so you're kind of seeing our first kind of dive into this. And as far as we're aware, at least at this scale, there hasn't been much research conducted. And so those types of questions are things that we're hoping to dive into once we kind of get through this preliminary just assessment of what's going on. So hopefully I'll be able to answer that in a couple of years.
I think it may also depend on your definition of old growth, given the amount of population and development that we've seen in the eastern U.S. for such a long period of time. We don't have, depending on how you define old growth, there's not a whole lot of old growth, anything remaining in the east anymore.
Very fair.
And then Fred, we've got some more questions that are coming in. Fred asked, does the defined size of large wildfires change as population and density on the WUIs increase? Therefore, should the Northeast be analyzed at a different scale? That's a really good question.
Yes, and this is something that we've thought a lot about, because as we shift to areas in the WUI where we're going to have a lot more fragmentation, it makes sense that we would actually start to see smaller fires. And unfortunately, the data that we have, at least right now, to analyze this is restricted to these larger wildfires. It's the data set that we have that's consistent across time and space, that isn't impacted by different jurisdictional boundaries, that allows us to do these large scale assessments. But NOAA did find that there were increases in size in some regions for these large fires, but we have no idea what's going on with the smaller ones. And so he's actually looking into different data sets right now where we can analyze the smaller fires and figure out what's going on, because we do know that that's a pretty big gap that we're missing, particularly in the east, which is characterized by much smaller fires than what we would see out west.
All right. So that was one of the questions that I had. I was curious if you felt like the MTBS data set may have influenced the kinds of interpretations and results that you have, and if there was some other kind of data set that you could use, or way that you could perhaps look at these same questions with fire sizes that were smaller than 200 hectares or roughly 500 acres.
Yeah, so there are data sets that we've pulled already, and we're looking at them. For instance, the data where we pulled stuff for ignition information actually is a great resource, and we're trying to make sure that we're familiar enough with how everything is categorized and what we might be missing before we choose the specific data set to dive into it. But that's the next step for us, absolutely, because it is a major limitation that needs to be acknowledged, that this is only large fires over 200 hectares in size, and we cannot speak to what's going on with smaller fires.
Yeah, and here in the Southeast, a 500-acre fire is a pretty big fire.
Right.
So, I mean, I don't have the data off the top of my head, but in terms of the distribution of wildfires that we have on the landscape, I think the bulk of the fires are smaller, right? Than
Yes,
500
absolutely.
acres.
Yeah.
It would be interesting to look at a lot of these similar questions if somehow you could at that smaller, finer spatial resolution of fires.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think now that we've done these broader scale analyses where we can kind of figure out what regions are being impacted and how, we'll start looking at more detailed and smaller scale studies as well, where we can then be less limited, I guess, by data restrictions and do more of that work too.
Well, looking at the clock, it looks like we've run up to our time today. So thank you so much for your presentation. So given all the questions and the Q&A that we've just had, are there any final comments or remarks that you would like to share today?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, the major thing that I want to get across with this presentation is that fire is a foundational part of the ecosystems that we live in here in the Southeast, and it's an inevitable occurrence. It's going to happen. And so we need to use this information. We have this early warning that we're seeing this shift, and we can get ahead of these changes in wildfire patterns if we shift how we manage and we shift how we perceive fire on landscapes, and we really learn how to coexist with fire rather than try to eliminate it.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. 1 second as we trade out slides here, and I'll get your contact information up on the screen, a little bit more info here. All right, you should be able to see that on the screen. So if we didn't get to your question today, or you had other questions or comments you wanted to follow up with Dr. Donovan, her email address is on the screen. You can reach out and connect with her. So today's webinar was recorded and it will be archived for later viewing on our Southern Fire Exchange YouTube channel. So look for that online in just a couple weeks. So with that, Dr. Donovan, thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you for taking the time to share the work of your lab with our audience and with our program.
Thanks so much for having me. And yeah, I really appreciate everyone coming out today.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody and have a great afternoon.